So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, just some follow-ups of things that I know I hear from students. I hear from teachers at different times, kind of the common questions that I think I get. And since you're the expert in this field, how you would answer those if you got these from students, right? So question I always get is, my uncle always said it was states' rights, and he was really adamant about that. And, when Thanksgiving comes up, I'm going to see this guy again. How do I explain the relationship between slavery and states' rights as an argument about what caused the Civil War and how people thought about it?
Right. So yeah, you're right, Andrew. I mean, we get this question all the time. Whether or not you want to deal with it over Thanksgiving is up to you and how upset you want to make your mother. But what I would say, and what I often say, when I have this conversation with not just students, but friends and neighbors, and, yeah, it was the state right to own slaves, to have slavery, right? I mean, yes, it was a state right, but that doesn't mean that it's not about slavery. And I also routinely use the secession documents themselves. How did those delegates explain their decision to their fellow Texans and to their peers in perhaps the US Senate, had their peers in Washington, for example? And overwhelmingly, what these documents say is we are leaving to protect our right as slaveholders or as future slaveholders, that this is a fundamental right. This is part of the economic success that Texas has worked so hard to achieve. If you look at Texans in 1850 as opposed to Texans in 1860, slaveholding had been a very profitable business for Texans. And so, yeah, but the easy go-to document, they're all available. I mean, you can just Google it and 1,000 copies of this, not versions, there's only one, will come up. And that's usually the go-to one you can do. But if you want to get deep into it with students, again, use Portal to Texas and use those newspapers that you were just talking about, Andrew. And you'll see it's not just wealthy politicians protecting slavery. It's very much part of the culture that's being protected too.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I always tell my students, well, first I say, how do we know it? Because they said it. Like that's a refrain I use regularly. And as you said, look at the documents from the era, because sometimes people who make the argument it wasn't about slavery pull from memoirs written decades afterward, where people like Jefferson Davis and other folks are saying, well, we really were talking about constitutionalism in a big, broad kind of way. It's like, I don't think that's why you were shooting at people. But but then that raises the question that I often get, and I know you do as well. Didn't most white Southerners not own slaves? So why would they fight a war? You talked about a rich man's war, poor man's fight in the talk. Why would they fight for slavery if they don't own slaves?
Yeah, and now I'm going to probably want to hear how you answer this question too, because we're getting into one of your real skill areas.
Refer everyone to your books. That's what I do. It's very simple.
It's a cyclical thing. I'm doing the same thing to you. What I often point out is a couple of things. When you look at the stats that say that only 30% of white Southerners actually own slaves, what that ignores are the family members who would borrow slaves, utilize slaves who were owned by other family members. And what it also ignores is the power that slaveholders had in the South. If you want loans, if you want any kind of assistance, if you want any kind of protection, it's all going to be tied to slaveholders. So you do not want to rock that boat. It's also tied to the fact that slaveholding is part of the thing that wealthy members of Southern society in particular achieve. And this is part of what a lot of middle-class whites and even poor whites are working to advance toward. It's seen as, in the 1850s at least, as a potentially very profitable business, which, as you've shown, Andrew, was not necessarily the case. But this is something that they're trying to secure. And so anything that's threatening that is threatening potentially a lot of whites' ability to advance socially and economically. And it's also tied to the fact that, as long as there's slavery, this is kind of that old Herrenvolk democracy argument. No matter how poor whites you are, whiteness provides power in the 19th century democracy and well beyond, historians have shown. But, and that whiteness and that power is going to be threatened if slavery disappears. And so those are usually the things that I point to.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think that it's it's important to point out to students, so I always try to, when I teach the Old South class, that slavery is an economic system, but it's also a political system, it's a social system, it's every part of society. So as you just talked about, you can be the poorest white guy in the county and everyone's above you, but you're not Black and you're not a slave, which makes you have the status you wouldn't otherwise have. That's definitely part of it. But that same real poor white guy desperately wants to be the rich guy at the very top. And this is the way up in the South, as everyone sees it, right? That's the economic opportunity. So if you're, born poor in the North, there's a way up. It's through free labor and saving your money and buying a farm. But in the South, if you can leverage enough money to buy an enslaved person, you can put that person to work in your fields. That's 8 to 10 more acres in cultivation. And that means 8 to 10 more acres of cotton if you're in the cotton belts. And that's your way up. You probably never get there, but just like today, most of us are never going to get to super wealthy status. Everybody wants that opportunity to get there. And that's the route that they see available to them. But it does mean we have to figure out how they see their position in society, not how we see it, but how they see it. And that's another trick, I think, for our students that's not always easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you then a follow-up on that I often get with students is like, well, you talked about on your map early on in the talk about these places there was resistance to secession, right? And these pockets of unionism that we see with the Gainesville hanging that persist. So I know there are people who voted against secession. There's 14,000 of them in Texas, right? And a lot of those people go into the fight once the war begins and join up with Confederacy. Not everybody, but there are people who shift to protecting the Confederacy. Like Sam Houston resisted secession, but after the war starts, he's not pushing against things, and his son goes in and almost gets killed at Shiloh. So my question to you is, how is the thinking different after secession? Like there's the debate till the war starts, and then once the war begins, there's a different kind of logic, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I often love to use, if you've kind of taken students through any kind of understanding of, how Constitution works and kind of, the social contract, right, where people give up certain rights in exchange for leaders protecting certain rights. I often talk about how, at the beginning of wars, people are often, rushing to arms. You very rarely hear the people who are like, wait a minute, do we really want to do this? And this is the group, right, that Thomas Paine referred to as the summer soldiers and the sunshine patriots. This is when it's fun to be a soldier. But, as wars drag on, as casualties add up, as disease takes its toll, as your family is not able to provide for itself because the main breadwinner is gone and the community is not providing what they promised they would, nor is the state or the county, wars become something very different for a lot of people, and it leads to this dissent. And again, to quote Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. This is when, now wait a minute, what are we doing here? And it's important to look at that dissent, which can come in many forms. It can come in forms of just critiques against the government, critiques against conscription. This is the first time in federal history that there was ever a draft. It's Confederate federal, but in US history, and the North's going to have its own draft about a year later. And, dissent can also take the form of, I was always a unionist. I never really wanted this war. This is exactly what I was worried was going to happen. Actually, it's worse. Dissent can come in the form that I'm an abolitionist. I never supported this. And I always wanted Texas to end slavery. And look at what the slave system and fighting over it is doing. You thought, protecting slavery would protect all of this wealth, it would protect our futures, and all it's doing is destroying it. And it can lead to people who will go as far as actually taking up arms to now join the Union against fellow Texans who are fighting for the Confederacy. So dissent comes in many forms, but it's a great way to talk about citizenship, free speech, what are your rights, what aren't your rights in Texas and, in the US as a whole.
Yeah. Especially because Texas has its western frontier with the Comanche and other Plains Indians groups that there's a lot of fear within Texas when a lot of these, military age males leave and go usually to the Mississippi, and then, those in the Hoods Brigade end up in the Eastern Theater, that they're feeling exposed out there in multiple directions. And so there's all kinds of tensions about who is doing what and who's protecting whom in these years in Texas.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can, you can take it to these kind of big national issues as they affect Texas, and these very kind of localized Texas issues that are being threatened by a lot of these larger decisions.
Absolutely. So you asked in your big question, which I love that as a guiding arc for the talk about like how the war changed Texas and Texas's role in all of this. So if you were to have a classroom of students, what would you give them as the big takeaways of how Texas was changed by the war?
So I think the biggest takeaway for Texas and the impact of the war is I would point toward the end of slavery and the impact that that's going to have on Texas. And I don't just mean it in terms of a slaveholding society and the economic change that comes with this. I mean in terms of this social, cultural, revolutionary change that happens when African Americans are no longer under the threat of being enslaved, and whites no longer have this overwhelming security of their power based on their freedom. And that's that revolutionary change that you're going to see all over the country, but particularly you're going to feel it if you're living in slaveholding states, particularly wealthier sections of slaveholding states that had large numbers of enslaved peoples. And even in parts of Texas where you didn't have large numbers of, say, plantations or farms that owned, say, 10 or fewer enslaved men, women, or children, you're going to see this massive influx of enslaved peoples during the war that really kind of changes those populations. And so it's going to have that effect too. The other thing I would point to is in some ways how protected Texas was compared to states like Louisiana, Mississippi, especially Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Texas isn't going to feel the physical impact of military campaigns like a lot of other states. And so in that sense, it's not going to have some of those recovery issues that you see in other areas.
Not Atlanta.
No, it's not Vicksburg. It's not, these places that are just, the landscape is almost forever changed.
But you look at Richmond, it looks like like Dresden did after World War II.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the war, I just can't believe that's 1865 Richmond. That's just a shell literally of itself.
Yeah, and you look at just the landscape of these where these campaigns go through, and it doesn't even look like anything pre-war. So that physical impact. But again, I don't think, and no matter where you are, whether you're in really large slaveholding states like South Carolina and Mississippi, where emancipation is going to have a massive impact, or if you're in states where you don't see necessarily as much enslavement, but still the social revolutionary changes, I think, have to be considered.
Yeah. Well, I love that you emphasize both those pieces, because Texas after the Civil War becomes a place where a lot of Southerners go to rebuild their lives, right? Mm-hmm. But after the war, Mississippi becomes a big place of migration for the lumber industry, but Texas does as well. And then Texas's populations just go through the roof after the war as both white and Black Southerners make their way to Texas. So it's part of the reason we have this massive immigration that affects the state for decades to come after the war. And I love that you pointed so directly to Juneteenth, because obviously it's symbolic for Texas, but it's becoming the national holiday for emancipation in this country and the ending of slavery and the beginning of a new era, not just in American history, but world history. I always tell my students, you have to understand, 1865 is a big deal in Texas and the United States and the South writ large. But it's really a marker in human history, because before that, almost all human societies believed slavery was natural and normal. And now we live in this era that you and I live in where that's not true anymore. And thank goodness for it. But we're in a very strange era in human history because of it. And so it gets to your point about what a massive difference 1865 really is, just beyond Texas, beyond the South, beyond the United States, really, about thinking about slavery and human rights in a broad sort of way.
No, absolutely. And I love Granger's orders because it also sets you up for how revolutionary that change is, right? There's no more slavery. And he's talking equality, right? He's throwing in words that are like, whoa. And yet he's also like, just kind of, let's back up a little bit though. And he's almost foreshadowing the problems that are going to come because white people, cannot seem to get past the relationship of,
Right.
master as employer, enslaved as hired labor.
Because everything's different. And I think that's something that's hard. In retrospect, we live in the aftermath, so that seems normal to us. But the challenge, I think, as teachers for our students is to bring them back and give them a sense of how revolutionary that is for everybody, for the enslaved who've been freed and have nothing, but now have everything because they're free.
Yeah.
And their former masters who've lost all this property and everything like that. We don't feel sorry for them for that. But just putting yourself in their place of the entire world has just been turned upside down and inside out. How do you make sense of that, right?
Right.
It really is this earthquake that just ripples across the landscape in ways that I think are hard to appreciate. This, we're not that far away, but it feels like such a different world in so many ways.
Oh yeah. And again, if you go back to the sources from that moment, right? If you go back to that kind of summer of 65 and just do a year of it, just go to the summer of 66. And you see all the things people are proposing and they're trying to figure out and the questions that they're asking. Yeah. I mean, it's like all of a sudden is, well, now what? Like, what do we do? So, yeah.
It's like gravity changed all of a sudden. We have to adjust everything.
Yeah. The whole world is kind of tilted.
Exactly. Well, why don't we dive into some documents that the teachers can use in their classrooms?
Yeah, absolutely.